Hello, my name is Zach Gibbs, and I'm a content developer within education services inside Juniper Networks. And today we will be going through the Verifying MAC VRF Isolated Tenants External Interconnect Learning Byte. All right, so here is our topology. In this topology, we have 4 switches in our data center. That is spine 1, spine 2, leaf 1, and leaf 2. And we've already configured all the VRFs. We configured the V10 VRF, V20 VRF, and the V10 T5 VRF and V20 T5 VRF. That is, the V10 VRF is a MAC VRF and the V20 VRF is a MAC VRF as well. And that was done in a different learning byte. And then in a more recent learning byte, we configured the V10 T5 VRF and V20 T5 VRF on leaf 2. Those other VRFs were on leaf 1. And so that is now all configured. And so what we want to do here is we want to make sure that host 1 and host 3 can communicate with each other. And then they can also communicate with devices on the internet. And to do that, they will have to send traffic into the V10 MAC VRF. For example, host 1, V10 MAC VRF, then would go into the V10 T5 VRF, would then go over to the leaf 2 V10 T5 VRF, and then it would go out to the gateway router. And similar type of deal for host 3, except that would be through V20 instead of V10. And so let's go ahead and jump to the CLI and look at some commands to see and verify that this is working correctly. Again, the configuration of this happened in different learning bytes, so please check out those learning bytes if you're interested in the configuration. All right, so here is leaf 1. Let's first look at the BGP sessions and with the BGP summary command. And you can see here that, well, first of all, we have the underlay sessions, which we're really not terribly interested in. But then we have sessions with the spine 1 and spine 2 devices, which are route reflectors in BGP. And you can see here that we are getting some routes, but we want to focus mainly on the routes that we are getting with the T5 routing instances. We're not getting anything through the V10 EVPN routing instances because of how MAC VRF is set up in this instance. And so what we are focusing on is the T5 routing instances. And you can see here with the V10 T5.evpn.0, we are getting one active route, and same thing with the corresponding V20. And we get the same thing on or from spine 2, but since it's the same routes, those routes are hidden. So we are getting routes. That's great. That's what we want to see. And so, well, before we go any further, let's just make sure we can communicate where we need to communicate. So host 1, let's see, we can ping the internet or host on the internet. We can, great. And with host 3, let's go ahead and ping, well, first a host on the internet. That's great. Then let's ping host 1 to make sure that communication works. And that does work as well. Okay, so great, because I know a lot of times with the EVPN, routes don't get passed until traffic starts flowing, so just want to make sure first. So let's go ahead and go back to leaf 1, and I don't think there's going to be any additional routes, and there's not, and that's good. That's what we want to see. And so let's look at the individual route tables to see exactly what we're getting. So let's do the show route table V10_T5. And you can see here, I'll scroll up some, that we are getting a default route through EVPN. And recall in the configuration learning byte that is associated with this learning byte that we configured the leaf 2 device to send a default route that it is getting from the gateway router into EVPN. And we see here we are receiving that. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want to see because this will allow the traffic from host 1 to be drawn towards the T5 routing instance on leaf 2, which then is able to reach a host on the internet through going through the gateway router. And we'll look at that in more detail here in a minute. But we can see we're getting that default route. That's perfect. And then if we look into the EVPN related routing table, we can see here that we do have a route for that 10.1.1.0. So that is the host 1 subnet. And so that's showing up here in the V10 T5. So that's coming from the V10 MAC VRF. And then we have this default route that is also showing up in the EVPN route table. So that's what we want to see there. That's very important. And then we can also look at the V20 T5 route tables. And we'll see a very similar story here. We see that default route. That's perfect. That's what we want to see. And then if we look in the EVPN related table, we can see the routes that are there as well. So that's perfect. That's what we want to see. And then, so with that, let's go ahead and jump to Leaf 2 and have a look at things. Let's do the show BGP summary, and it should be very similar. You can see here that we are getting a route in each routing table for the T5. And that's perfect. Now, recall that Leaf 2 doesn't have any MAC VRF routing instances. It only has the T5, the Type 5 routing instances. And so, because remember that Leaf 2 is acting as border leaf, which is then connecting to the gateway router. And so that's great. So let's look at the show route. And first, let's look at the default route. Recall that we are getting a default route from the gateway router. And so let's look at that. And so you can see a few things here. You can see that in the inet.0 table that we have that default route. And that is because the BGP group that is connecting, the BGP session that is connecting to the gateway router is in the main routing instance. And that is very important to know because we had to configure something to get that routing information into the Type 5 routing instances, right? And we did that with rib groups. And so you can see now that we have that in the main instance. And then here in the V10 T5 and V20 T5 routing instances, that route is also there. And that came from the main routing instance. And we used a rib group to import that into these other two routing instances. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we want to see. And so let's just look at the actual routing tables themselves. The V10 routing tables. And so again, you do have that default route, and that's great. But we also have this route. Now, this is the V10 routing table. We have this route, which represents the host 1 subnet. And recall that on Leaf 1, we are advertising that route into EVPN as a Type 5 route. And so we're advertising that towards this Type 5 routing instance, the V10 T5 routing instance on Leaf 2. And so that's shown up there. That's perfect. That's what we want to see because we're going to have to advertise that route to the gateway router. So that is very, very important. And then if we look at the EVPN routing table, we see the corresponding routes as well in the EVPN routing table for V10 T5. So then let's look at V20 T5, and we'll see something very similar. Here is the route for the host 3 subnet and also the default route. And it's the same type of deal. We're getting that default route from the gateway router, and that default route showed up in the main routing instance. We used rib groups to put that in this table, this route table. And then, of course, you had that host 3 subnet that is being advertised from the V20 T5 routing instance on Leaf 1. And then again, we do have the corresponding routes in the EVPN related table as well. And so with that, we are advertising. So let's do the show route advertising protocol BGP. And let's look at see what we're advertising towards spine 1. And you can see here what we're advertising. See the BGP EVPN, we're advertising these two routes. So what are these? These are for the default route. And then you can see that broken out into the individual routing instance EVPN tables. And so that's great. Now, what are we advertising towards the gateway router? That is also very important. Recall that we need to advertise the subnets that are related to host 1 and host 3 towards the gateway router. And you can see we are advertising stuff. There are the two subnets. We're also advertising some loopback addresses, which is not bad. We could filter those out, but the important part is we have those subnets that are being advertised towards the gateway router. Then one last thing to look at is if we look at the gateway router, which in this case is an SRX. And so something else to keep in mind is you might be using something, this might not be a gateway router. It might actually just be a full-on firewall that then might forward traffic to a gateway router. So you can actually do some filtering, some advanced threat protection stuff or whatnot. And so, but in this situation, we're just using it as a gateway router. But we can do the show route protocol BGP. See what we're receiving, and we are receiving those two routes. We saw that we were advertising them, and we are receiving them. So the gateway router knows how to get to the host 1 and host 3 devices. And if we do the show route 0/0, look at the default route, there's a static route that points to another device. In our case, it is towards the internet. And so that's how things are getting out to the internet there. And then if we look at the show security flow session protocol ICMP, we can look at the actual ICMP sessions. And we see here that we have traffic coming from host 3 and it is going to host 1. And then the return traffic is also flowing. And so we could control this traffic. Say we don't want that to happen. We don't want host 1 to talk to host 3 and vice versa or whatever. We could control that at this device here. And then we can see that host 1 is communicating with a host on the internet, and the host on the internet is then sending traffic back to host 1. And the reason why this looks a little funny here, you don't see host 1's IP address because NAT is happening here. And so that's why you see that there. And so the devices are able to communicate with each other and host on the internet, and the correct routes are being passed around on the correct devices. So that does bring us to the end of this Learning Byte. In this Learning Byte, we demonstrated how to verify isolated tenants, that is L2 and L3 isolated tenants, with an external interconnect with MAC VRF in a data center. So as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.